So, today, what I'm going to start off with is talking about Eventide and where it's at. We are now just under halfway done or just over halfway through NaNoWriMo, right? It goes throughout the month of November, and that is 30 days long. So, and today is the 16th. So, all the writers out there should be crossed over 25,000 words. I did that days ago. As a matter of fact, as of today, I have broken 30,000 words. So I'm doing very well. Things are coming along very nicely. This week saw kind of a real burst in the setting material. As I said, I've been building this, I have two main documents. One that's filled with setting material, one that's filled with rules material. The rules material comes in fits and spurts as I need it. But the setting material is just things that I'm kind of waiting for inspiration. So I kind of use them both as foils for each other so that when I'm stuck on one thing, I just drop it and go work on something else. It's actually working out really well. But this week, the long kind of standing block of setting material finally shook loose and words just flowed. There was a day this week that I wrote nearly 3,000 words. In a 24-hour span. It was actually broken up over 2 different writing days, but anyway, it's really started to come together really quite nicely, to the point that I've finally realized that this isn't just a project that I'm probably going to be like, I wrote 50,000 words, I guess I'll just let that sit. 50,000 words is a lot, and I'm really starting to look forward to how I'm going to make this into a actual product. So I've started to look around for artists, and if folks want to hit me up with any artists that they really like, I'll be sure to consider them. I have an artist that I really enjoy working with, but there's no way he can do all of the pieces I need, and to be honest, he's gotten so good and so skilled that he is now commanding rates that are a bit higher than my budget allows. So I'm starting to look for more art. We'll see how that plays out. That's always a bit of a challenge, but I definitely want to get like a cover and things like that underway so that I have pieces to kind of market this whole thing with. So today, what I really want to talk about, though, is some of this setting material that's been developed over the past week. And some of it is stuff I've had seeds for quite some time now, but it hasn't really fully come together until just this week. And that is talking about kind of the bullseye of the region, of the setting material, because I'm designing this as kind of the way I always tell home GMs to build their content, which is focus on one small area and build out from there. Do one part that is hyper detailed, that is the place where the adventure is taking place, where the players actually are, because that's where they're going to have the most questions, that's where they're going to interact with people. And then each ring outside of that, and it's not necessarily geographic, but it is kind of content, is a little lighter, is a little less detailed, because you don't need as much to make that area work. So for me, that is taking a part of the Allnear continent, which is the kind of northern large continent in this world, and picking a spot that is kind of in the northern latitude of that, just within the temperate kind of band, but kind of in the northern reaches of that. And it's a place called the Icescar Valley. Now, this Icescar Valley is kind of the main setting in the Gazetteer. The Gazetteer is about half talking about the world and the setting as a whole, and then the other half is really focused in on the Icescar Valley and the largest town in the Icescar Valley, which is called Wyrmbone. Now, I picked this for a few reasons. One, it's outside of the Zankar Imperium, which is this very large nation that dominates much of the continent. But the Zankar Imperium is kind of a very rigid, structured place to live, and I wanted some place that was a little bit more wild, a little bit more like a frontier, a place where adventurers are born. And to that end, I decided to pick a town that has kind of layers of history. I wanted there to be kind of ages of this town and this valley that might provide layers of depth for the players to explore. You can investigate things that are happening in the town right now, or you can dig into what happened in the years after the town's founding, or you can go even further back when it was an elven settlement, and deeper back than that when the elves and the dwarves were still at war with each other, and this valley was kind of untouched wilderness. There's lots of different layers here and different ages of the story to explore, which also then is layering in depth for you as GMs to create mysteries, to create wonders, to create things to find and explore. So, let me go over a little bit of history of the Icescar Valley. Actually, so funny enough, it wasn't called Wyrmbone until about 400 years ago. Before that, it had two different names depending on the era that we're talking about, but I'll get to that. So back when the town first, before the town was even a town, this valley up here is between the Blue Claw Mountains, which run along the northern edge of the continent and are in fact where the Ulnir continent butts into the Arctic plate, and a spur of what's called the Rotten Peaks, which is a very old crumbling mountain chain that's probably just like a plate fold. Those happen, and the rock there is weak and chalky, and it's not a huge mountain range, but it is enough to create this valley. Now, being as north as it is, and having kind of nestled between two mountain ranges, means that the northern winds really howl down this place. In the winters are long and deep in this valley. And as a result, the early elven settlements, or early elven explorers, didn't stay here. They came to this valley, now close to 2,000 years ago is when they first explored it, and they didn't stay. They found the winters too cold and too harsh for them, and instead decided to set up some encampment that, because the valley is also very nice, very mild in the summer months, they set it up so that in the summer months, elven nobles might come here to summer, because it is a very pleasant, wild place that they could come and summer away from the heats to the south and hunt in kind of the pristine wilderness. So that's how it first started. But as the community there grew, as the number of nobles coming in the summer grew and the amount of people coming up here grew, there were people who started to try and stay the winter. And those first few years were very difficult. There are like frost wolves and big giant white wolves and frost giants that range down from the mountains in the north in the winter. The freezing cold, the deep snows. The place was pretty inhospitable for those early years, but they persevered. And over the next 100 years or so, they founded what first went from being like a noble's retreat. They are winter wolves. My brain spaced on that. No heart. They're winter wolves. In that first 100 years, it went from being a small retreat to being an entire village, which they named Ilsanvanir, which means frozen hearth in Elven. It is so named because the first people who stayed there literally had the hearth in the center of their house with the food in the kettle freeze solid. So Ilsanvanir was a growing place. It didn't start out large. It started out pretty modest. But over the next 100 years, the town slowly grew. And as it did so, they started to look at ways to kind of make this place more livable. Now, at this point in time, it was just elves. The dwarves, who also were very active back in this part of history, were much further to the south, and there was a war that lasted about 80 or 90 years between the elves and the dwarves, and as a result, the dwarves weren't in this part of the world. But when the truce came with the dwarves in -533, the first dwarves came to this valley soon after, once kind of relations were normalized. Dwarves came up here because of the mountains. They came up here to check and see if any of these were worth investigating, worth exploring. And they found the rotting peaks to be worthless for the most part. And in fact, they are the ones who named them that. But the Blue Claw Mountains were filled with a lot of silver and a lot of gems. And as a result, they quickly began setting up outposts and mines. The elves didn't mind as long as the dwarves didn't make too much of a mess of the valley. They didn't really care too much about the mines themselves. So the dwarves founded a fortress up in the mountains to mine and to control all of the mine heads in the region, and they called this place Rhymeshield. Rhymeshield was never a gigantic fortress. At most, the fortress and the small mines around it held about 200 dwarves total. But they started mining the region and shipping south large wagon loads filled with silver and gems. And they did this for about 300 years. During this period of time, the valley itself really started to grow. The elves started a very long-term project to make Ilsanvenir a bit more hospitable by planting blue needle pines throughout the wood, especially to the west of the town, to serve as kind of a breaker against the winter's worst winds for the town itself. This was a long-term project, though, because the trees take centuries to grow to full size. And everything seemed to be going okay until at about around -70. So that would put this about 1,200 years ago. Deep in the winter, the dwarves, a few dwarves came straggling into Ilsanvenir, speaking of a catastrophe in the mountains. They said that something had come out of the mountains for them and refused to speak much more of it. And in fact, I'm not even going to give you any hints about it right now. But the very few of them survived, and they had horrible, horrible frost burns across their body. They said never to go back to that place, to leave it unexplored, and that all the dwarves there were dead. The elves, for their part, listened to them and did not go to explore the old ruins of Rhymeshield, and from that point onward, Rhymeshield lay abandoned. Some of the dwarves stayed in town, many of them fled south. And things were going along. You know, the valley had been tamed. not quite Valantrix, but you get the point. Ilsanvenir continued to grow, and by the time at the start of the Taimok dynasty, which marks the modern era, that's 0 TD, the Ilsanvenir had almost 1,000 elves living in it, and things were going along well. The project to bulwark the town against the cold had been mostly successful. The trails were now well marked and well kept. The entire place was really kind of working out well. But that would not last. In 276, the sky went dark in the 3-week period known as Eventide. For most of the world, it was bad enough that it was dark, but for Ilsanvenir, it was already autumn, and the first snows had already started to fall, and when the skies went dark and the sun did not raise, they spent 3 weeks in freezing cold. A blizzard came in the middle of it. By the time the sun finally returned, over 120 elves had died in the cold. Many just from not having enough fuel, not having enough food, not having enough water. The wells froze over, the stream froze over, and many perished. This would be the turning point for Ilsanvenir as a community. From that point forward, the elves slowly started to leave this place. Many of them fled south. That next year, once the winter finally broke, fully half of the remaining townsfolk packed up and left. They went south. Many were terrified that what happened would happen again, that maybe this was a new annual occurrence, and they weren't willing to risk spending 3 weeks in the freezing cold north with no light. They were unwilling to do that, so they fled south. And over the next 200 years, the town went from a growing, vibrant community to a ghost town. And in fact, by 573, the last elf who lived in the town, refusing to leave, died of natural causes, leaving the place a ruin. An empty ruin. But there were still elves in the region, they just didn't live... They just didn't live in Ilsanvenir. Some lived in other smaller communities, sheltering in different places, almost avoiding the place because, there was like, is it haunted? We're not going there. That's not a place we want to deal with. So, that would be the end of Ilsanvenir. About 70 years later, that was in about 573. At this point in time, elves all around the world were going into decline. The entire Elven Empire at this point in time, or Elven Collective, had collapsed. The dwarves had retreated underground. This is a few hundred years after that moment of Eventide where things changed and magic started behaving not as expected by these ancient races. And it wasn't until like 640, so this is about 500 years ago, that humans and goblins finally started coming here and settling this place. And along with the elves, the first couple winters, especially now that everything had fallen into ruin and much of the forest had gone wild, they didn't stay. They came, they explored, they saw the place, and then they went back south because it does get so cold here in the winter. But over the years, eventually, some folks decided to come and try and reclaim the elven ruins. At this point in time, they called the place Elf Run, because the elves had run from the place. They weren't being too clever about it, but that early settlement there was basically in the ruins of old elven buildings, and they started by building mostly in the center of the community, building a wall around the place to keep out predators and help shield the folk inside from the worst of the winter winds. The place grew slowly at first, and it wasn't until 770 when the population really exploded. At that point in time, the first of the woodsmen discovered the strange trees that lived in the forest. Not all of them, but some of them were truly bizarre trees because it seemed that their roots would pull up minerals from the ground, and that mineral would find a way to just form like a cyst inside the wood. And when you cut open that wood, if you were careful, you would find small gemstones inside the wood. And these gemwood trees kind of sparked a rush. Loggers from all over the place basically rushed here to try and find these trees. They were rare. They weren't everywhere in the forest, so a logger might go out into the woods and spend 2 weeks looking for one and not even find one. But a lot came to try and find their luck. Finding one of these trees could net you immense wealth because some of these trees were very, very old and very large, having incredibly large gemstone cysts inside of them. So things really grew in the town, and over the next 40 years or so, the town's population exploded, rising to almost 5,000 people, mostly humans, goblins, halflings, a few elves, one or two dwarves, not very many, and these folk just swarmed into the town. Thank you for the sub, BD Fisher, I appreciate that. And Chaotic Gordon, thanks for stepping by. We will see you next time. So, in 807, the town was about 5,000 people. But in one day on the summer, a dragon came down from the north. It flew low over the forest and gave very little warning before it was on the town. None, even to this day, are quite sure why it came, what drew its ire, but it circled the town, laying down sheets of flames, burning much of the southern reach of the town, whose old elven ruins, many of which were kind of half rebuilt, easily caught flame. In the end, the dragon settled on a tower in the center of town. This tower was called Wulfrin's Tower. The old wizard Wulfrin lived there. And the dragon settled atop this tower and began ripping it to pieces, literally just grabbing chunks of the stone and flinging them off into the town, trying to get at whatever was inside. And quite suddenly, according to legend, it just fell over dead. It let out a mournful roar and collapsed atop the tower. Over the next few days, the townsfolk tried to get their lives back together. They spent the entire first day just trying to put out the fires and tend to the wounded, ignoring the dead dragon in the center of town. But over the next few days, the dragon's flesh rotted away, leaving behind a petrified skeleton draped over this tower. And to this day, that skeleton and ruined tower are still there. Of the wizard, there was never a sign again. Most assumed that he died in the attack, that the tower collapsed atop him and he was inside when it happened. That was in 807. The town got a new name that day. It started to be known by all the travelers as Wyrmbone, the place with the Wyrmbone skeleton draped atop a tower. As a result, the folk of the town began to rebuild, and they did so by building kind of a really tightly clustered area around the center of town, forming the district known as Black Arch. This district was there before that. It was kind of the central hub and the first real community there. It was named Black Arch after the attack because the district itself didn't suffer much damage except for the destruction of the tower and its southern gate, which mostly collapsed, leaving behind one blackened arch of stone, hence the district's name. To the north of that is the reach of the town that ventures out into the forest. That is where most of the intact ancient elven buildings still are. The ones in the center of the town mostly got repurposed. The ones on the south of town mostly got burned down. So the ones on the north are the only place where there are any elven structures still remaining from, several hundred years ago. They're old and well maintained. But that area is known as Gemtree. And it is actually the only place in town where there is an actual living gem tree in the kind of middle of the district. Below that, in the southern district, where many of the buildings burned down, is a part of town called the Jumbles. And this is a hodgepodge mix of ancient buildings and newer buildings, and a lot of different styles. The entire area was kind of a free-for-all after the dragon burned it down. So many people died during the attack, and so many buildings were destroyed. The reconstruction was real haphazard, and as a result, the buildings are kind of a lot of different styles. The roads are only loosely followed, and the entire area is a bit of a chaotic mess. But it's also the place where most of the folk in the town live. The Black Arch is mostly filled with businesses and very small places to live. Whereas Gemtree to the north is filled with, that's where most of the nobles and aristocrats who are in town live. And then last but not least, outside of all of this is an area called the Fields. Now, it's called that because that's where the farming fields are, but there are people who live out there, especially clustered close to the city's newer outer wall. They had a wall kind of around Black Arch, and then I think it's about 50 years ago or so, they built another wall to envelop all of the Jumbles and Gemtree, so that the town could be easily defended or protected. They do still get monsters and whatnot in the winter, so it's best to have some defense. But not in the fields. If you live out in the fields, you're kind of out in the open. Many of the houses out there are kind of smaller, lightly constructed things. There are some tents, there are some shacks, there are plenty of very modest structures, and it tends to be where those with little coin live in town. For their part, the town council is actually very concerned about these folks and trying to find ways to give them a better standard of living. But it's a slow-moving process. So, that's kind of the basic layout of the town. Today, the entire area is a bit more wild than it was back in the Elven days. Once the elves left, the area of the Gemwood went back to the wild. And many of the places out in the wilderness that were once more tame and more regular, not that the elves were much for like driving out beasts or anything like that, they just tried to give everything its space and balance so that everything could live in harmony. It's gone back to the wild now. Now there are more communities than there were then. There are other communities in the Icescar Valley, but of them, Wyrmbone is by far the largest. It sits at a major crossroads of a merchant path that leaves Wyrmbone behind and eventually heads all the way out to the Siren Sea, which is far off to the west. And there at the Siren Sea, it ends in a port town called Varnathus. And Varnathus is one of the largest free cities in the north that is outside the Icescar Imperium. And it's a city sitting on a port in the far north, and it happens to be sitting on a bunch of thermal vents. So as a result, it's this giant stone city that somehow manages to stay warm even in winter. That's one end of the trail. The other end of the trail is on the other side of the continent, traveling through the Rotten Peaks and all the way to the other coast, where there is another port community over there. So it kind of sits right there in the middle of that, right in the middle of this valley. And there's also a trail that ends here. It does technically go north to the old ruins of Rhymeshield, but it also heads south, leading into the Icescar Imperium, although it leads to a town that wasn't originally part of that. It was annexed only 50 years ago or so. So, as a result, it sees a lot of trade. It sees a lot of people trying to avoid being in the Imperium for various reasons that are all their own. It is a town filled with merchants and travelers and explorers, and it's kind of the perfect place to start your adventures. That was my goal with this town. It's not huge. It's something that, a GM can easily kind of grasp and work with, but it's also got a lot going on and a lot happening in the nearby environment for you to explore, to set your own adventures, and it itself is going to be the site of the first adventure I'm going to be writing for the Eventide setting. Remember, this whole thing started out as a big, giant, dramatic adventure, and I still want to do that adventure, but that adventure is not set in Wyrmbone. It's actually set in another town called Aubenglade that is far to the south. I'll get to Aubenglade. I'm just starting with this to give everyone a playground to work with. So, what else can I tell you about Wyrmbone as a town? So I've told you that it's divided up into 4 districts. The biggest thing that I've spent a lot of the week doing is building some of the families and houses, and a bunch of the businesses and locations that you can visit. I don't want to talk too much about the families and houses and stuff because that work is still in process and a lot of it's subject to change. But I have a bunch of great businesses in this town that are going to be a lot of fun to play with. I just want to talk about a handful of them while I have some time here, and then I'll open it up to some questions. So when you first arrive in town, you've got your choice of a handful of places to stay right now. You can always stay at the 8 Horse Inn, which is a simple coaching inn for merchants and travelers, run by the Scarich clan of goblins, who they pride themselves in tending to merchants and travelers who want to get back on the road as quickly as possible. So they can fix your wagons, they can shoe your horses, they can offload your cargo and have it delivered. They're kind of the full-service inn. And to top it off, every night, the Scarich Goblin children put on some sort of show in the common room, usually a musical number. You could also stay in the Skygaze Inn. If you have a bit more coin and are willing to spend it, you can stay in the Skygaze Inn. This is an inn located in the Gemtree district in the northern part of town, and it is built in the ruins of an old elven observatory, where there is, in fact, a large telescope still protruding from this inn. If you book your room far enough in advance, you can sit at the observer's table, which allows you to actually look through the eyepiece and look up into the night skies. The place is obviously booked, for years in advance whenever there is a astrological occurrence about to happen. And in fact, on the bigger ones, they don't even allow anyone to book the table. They move the table out of the way and have a kind of a giant party where folks can come and look at the stars. The owners of the place are astronomers themselves, and the rooms are filled with star charts and books about astronomy. Of course, there are also religious scholars that like to visit this place because the gods are tied to constellations, and as a result, there is some linkage there. But yeah, that's the Skygaze Inn. Of course, if you're looking for something quite a bit cheaper, and I do mean very, very cheap, you can always stay at the Catacomb. This is located in Black Arch, so it's in kind of the center of town, and the Catacomb is in a mausoleum. So you're not really renting a room, more as you are renting a niche down in the catacombs. It's a tiny little place. The owner of it, a man by the name of Vargas, dresses like a mortician and welcomes you to the fine establishment where you can pay just a few copper to sleep the night in a warm, dry catacomb. No. The skeletons have all been removed, but there are some macabre reminders that you are living in a place, you are sleeping in a place for the dead. His motto, of course, is why sell to the dead when you can rent to the living? So that's the Catacomb in Black Arch. Now, there's plenty of places to stay. That's not all of them, but that's a good chunk of them. Remember, this is a town that sees a lot of merchants and a lot of travelers. So there's a lot of inns and places for people to stay. But beyond that, there's lots of places where you can go and shop and buy things. One of my favorites that's in here is a place called, where is it here? The Teetering Tower. This is also in Black Arch. It is a bookshop. Built in the back of an alley. It's like a full 5 stories tall wooden structure, but it looks like each floor was built individually, each kind of off-center from the other. So the whole thing kind of even looks like a giant stack of books. And inside, in each floor, there are massive bookshelves going floor to ceiling in the entire place. There are thin, almost ladder-like staircases going between the floors. The owner of the place doesn't even know the full catalogs of her establishment. But on top of kind of all of the rare and esoteric books that are in this place, and strange scrolls and things like that, each floor has a number of cases filled with strange curios, objects, and things that the owner has collected over the years. Her name is Kendry. And so many of the things she has are just simply strange objects. Things like the shell of an egg that supposedly came from a dragon, a chunk of ore that came from the mines under Frost Shield. There's also some objects that are obviously slightly magical. Nothing amazing, but some of them have obvious magical properties. There is a cracked crystal ball that shows what happened in the room around it 10 minutes ago. but that's it. So when you walk in, you look into it and you don't see yourself. But if you wait long enough, you will walk into the room and gaze into the crystal ball. It's a place filled with odd curios and random objects. None of them are supposedly for sale. But rumor has it that Kendry will part with them if she has reason to. So what else? There's plenty of places to shop, plenty of places to visit. You can of course go to the museum that's across from the ruins of Wulfrin's Tower. There's a museum called Wulfrin's Last, and inside it catalogs everything from the day that the dragon attacked. You know, it has artifacts, it has piles of ash from things that were burnt away, and it has the entire contents of Wulfrin's shed, which was behind his tower, which was untouched in the attack. And inside are things like tools and stuff like that, but there was also half a bottle of wine that they still have, hence the name of the museum. It was the joke is that was his last drink before wandering into his tower and having it fall down on top of him. The owner of the place is a human man by the name of Hadram, who's been in this shop business for like 50 years. He actually came here to explore, to investigate this, and has been scholarly investigating the attack and the ruins of the tower ever since. He built the museum. So he knows a great deal about that time period and has a bunch of kind of wild theories about what actually happened. Camelot, thanks for stopping by tonight. I hope you have yourself a good evening. So that's not the only business across from Wulfrin's Tower. There's another one called Stonefang Tavern. The Stonefang Tavern is kind of the touristy tavern in town. Those who visit and want to get a good look at the dragon, which, by the way, I'm going to let you all have a good look at here in just a minute, because I realized today that I found a little drawing I did a few years ago that kind of inspired this whole town. But if you go there, you can hear all kinds of stories about the place, and there you might even be able to buy a bone or something like that. There's always something to sell. The halfling owner of the place, Shirath Alewife, is happy to entertain guests with tales about the dragon, and sell folks relics and bits of esoterica about that day. Whether or not any of those are true or not, or real, that's an interesting question. Of course, B.D. Fisher has the right of it. The room, the tables along the windows with a good view of the dragon, because it's just a tavern, you can't even stay there. Obviously, those cost extra just to sit there. I've been having a lot of fun designing new locations. I've got like 30 or 40 of them here. There's a shrine that wanders from place to place, dedicated to Sylara, the goddess of chaos. There is an illegal still and gambling den that you get access to by belching at the door guard. There's a gem merchant located inside a living tree. There is, a shop that caters specifically to explorers and those wishing to kind of wander these lands, filled with maps and gear and tools necessary to explore the region beyond. There's a soup kitchen located out in the fields where you can go and help the halfling staff there take care of the workers. There's an alchemist shop where the alchemist is behind the counter and has always been asleep. No one's ever seen him awake. But you best not steal from him, because those who do find that the goods that they steal oftentimes go terribly, terribly wrong. So there's a whole bunch of things here to explore. And all of these locations well, not all of them, but many of the locations have adventure hooks tied to them. They have ways that they are related to other places in town or other locations in the valley. The whole thing is designed to be a playground for you to explore. And the first person to play with it is going to be me. With a adventure that I'm going to include with the kind of starting offering called The Ruins of Wulfrun's Tower. So, I don't want to talk any more about it because I'm just not ready to talk about anything about the adventure. Suffice to say, the town is about to go through some crazy stuff. So it should be an awful lot of fun. And I'm going to have a great time exploring this town, and I hope you do too. The town is really designed to be a place that's just kind of fun to play with. Are there rules for booby-trapped alchemy? Not booby-trapped per se, but there are guidelines for what happens if you steal from Veril. Veril being the alchemist who sleeps. BD Fisher, I will say this: the adventure starts at level 1. It's designed to be for first level characters. I want people to start out at the beginning and begin to explore this valley, this town, and the kind of fun adventures you can have here. So there's so much more that I haven't talked about. There's a whole bunch of things I don't want to spoil, so I just haven't even bothered mentioning them. But there are a lot of really fun things and fun adventure hooks floating around in here. And I'm just getting started. Like, this whole thing, this section is designed to be... I'm just scrolling back up. The section on details is 15,000 words by itself. I've written a third of that, a quarter at most. So there's still so much more I'm going to build into it, and I can't wait for all of you to get a chance to explore it, because there really is some great stuff in here. So one thing I wanted to show everyone was the inspiration for all this. You know, as I said, this campaign setting has been being built for several years now, and some of it is just an amalgam of various ideas that I had kind of brought together to make one larger piece. But there was always one component of it, and this came from like early last year, which was just an inspiration for an idea that kind of crystallized into an image in my head that I decided to draw. And I posted a picture to social media about it, and I doubt very many of you remember it or even happen to see it. So I'm going to show it here. I've got it loaded up here so you can take a look at it. And this is a hand drawing that I did of Wulfrun's Tower. So you can see the crumbled remains here. I don't know that I would quite go with this look today, but the idea of having a dead skeletal dragon draped over the ruins of a tower was really evocative to me. The idea really stuck in my head. And I decided to break out my pens and pencils and do this sketch. This was one of the earliest pieces that would form the kind of foundation for the town of Wyrmbone. So, you know, it's not my finest work, and like I said, it's not what I would probably do today. Kaffa, you have exactly the right of it. It's probably bigger than that, and the tower is probably bigger than that. It's too small for what I have envisioned for it now. But yeah, that was kind of the initial inspiration for this town. That it's a town with a landmark. I like having a town where there's something in it that you go, oh yeah, that's the thing that it's known for, or that's the thing that is iconic to that town. I think in our own world, we are able to, you know, view these towns by their landmarks almost immediately. Like if I say Paris, there's 2 or 3 buildings you're gonna think of, and probably the Eiffel Tower is the first one, right? Because it's such a landmark, it's such a monument. So I wanted a town that kind of evoked that sort of feeling. I think that's important to give everyone a sense of place. The moment everyone starts envisioning this place the same way, that's how you're creating a better shared story, a better shared environment. And the skeleton, yeah, of course, it's very safe because the skeleton is still there, right? I mean, the skeleton of the dragon just kind of collapsed atop the tower, or the dragon collapsed atop the tower, and when all of its flesh kind of rotted away in just a few days, what was left behind was a dragon skeleton that had petrified. No one's quite sure why that happened, but its bones were made of stone at that point, and it couldn't be moved. They tried to move it, and they just couldn't do it. And in the weeks after, eventually they just kind of decided to leave it. They didn't really know what to do. They could have spent a great deal of time tearing it down, but they had so many other problems in town that, you know, with all the fires and all the dead, that it just wasn't a priority. And Nohar, I'm glad you asked that, because they did get to a point where they're like, well, why don't we just mine it? And people wanted to take pieces of it, but they quickly found that aside from its own like decay, because a couple bones had fallen off, the rest of it is nigh unto indestructible. They can't break it. However, over time, pieces of it have fallen off of its own regard, and those have been collected. Yeah, are the PCs going to walk up and cast Detect Magic? Yeah, they probably will. But, you know. Yeah. No, it is kind of the town's tourist attraction. Those who have never been here before oftentimes come here just to take a peek. So, yeah, that was the initial inspiration for it. That's where the first ideas for Wyrmbone came from, and I'm kind of excited to see where it goes next. So if folks have any questions, I'll take a few questions here, and then we'll probably move on. Yeah, King Trash, you really can't steal the bones. That's they're not okay with that. Yeah, so Nohar, that's the thing, right? The skeleton isn't something that you can just go up and bash. If you do, you end up hurting your weapon, not the skeleton. Folks have tried. So, but you might get more insight into it. You might get more of the mystery in the adventure, the ruins of Wulfrun's Tower, which is kind of going to be the first adventure set in this world. Yeah, I mean, you could steal the whole tower and just dig the whole thing up and move it. Sure. Don't think some rich noble hasn't thought about that. Because, I mean, of course they have, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, crack glitches are fun, so it's fine. There was a fossil golem in first edition, or something similar to it. Yeah, I don't want to give anything away, but there's some fun things hiding in this particular part of the setting that I'm looking forward to exploring. The old Wulfrun's Tower is obviously going to be the first one, but there's some other stuff in here too, like what happened up in Rhymeshield. You know, what happened with there's an elven commune in the south that's gone a little weird. That's worth exploring. There's other strange mysteries in the forest. There's like a dozen weird menhirs located in the forest that predate the elves that no one quite has an answer to. What's security like in town? In Wyrmbone, the town is governed by a council of 3, one of which is a noble, another seat is a priest, and the third seat is an elected member from one of the trades guilds, but it cannot be one of the guild masters, so it's always one of the workers, and they, as a group, control the blue banners, which are the blue pine banners, which are like the knights of this region. The rule of law here is, I wouldn't call it strict. I would say that it's the kind of place that I would call neutral good. They're gonna understand if, you know, an accident occurs and not punish you unduly. But they're also not going to let you just, you know, steal wantonly. And they try and keep a pretty good watch on the town. I would say that their influence is more along the road and on the inside of the town than it is, say, out in the fields or out in the surrounding environments. There is, of course, a bit of an underbelly in the town. I mentioned that there is an illegal still and gambling house. There are some things like that operating in town. There is also kind of a shadowy cabal of merchants and things like that. There's some politics and stuff, but a lot of that has to do with individuals, and some of that is still coming together. So I'm going to play a little close to the vest because I don't want to say things that aren't quite fully baked yet. Of course, there's an underbelly. The tower is under the dragon's belly. Yes, of course, yeah. Frodo, are there Fae? Not really. There are very few. No one's seen much in the way of Fae in a long time. There are not underground cockatrice fights. I've always seen cockatrices as being more arid, warm climate creatures. Maybe that's just me. I don't see them as being cold northern climate creatures just because. If they had any fighting rings here, it would probably be amongst like winter wolves, yeah, they might have like fights between various birds of prey and things like that, like hawks. I don't see them having cockatrices. Yeti fight. I mean, a Yeti fight's just funny. So I mean, yeah. There's going to be that. I don't know. You can't catch a Yeti and bring it to town, especially not two of them. It's not something you can hide easily. I don't know. Is making two animals fight for fun an evil act? I think that generally is. Whether or not they're intelligent or not. Yeti wrestling. That sounds good. I'd watch that. I'd pay for that on pay-per-view. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if they're having fun, it's not illegal, right? It's not illegal if they like it. Yeti versus Winterwolf is just like the cold monster bracket, right? So yeah, I'm really having a lot of fun with this. I really burned through a lot of words this week and was shocked at how many words I could crank out when writing about locations and stuff. I actually had to slow down because I was like, I'm gonna end up with so much of this that I'm not going to be able to fit the other stuff I need to do, and I need to write some thinner locations. But then again, this is also just a PDF at this point in time, so it can really be as big as I want it to be. But I have other words to write, so. You know, as of today, I've cracked 30,000 words. That means I only have 20,000 words left in the initial chunk of this, but my outlines are more like 80,000 word outlines. So it's gonna be, I'm not gonna be done at the end of November. It's probably gonna take me well into December to get all of the words done. But yeah, non-combat quests, King of Trash. I will give you one or two clues here that there's some stuff in here. Not everything's about fighting. I'm not, as a GM, I definitely like to mix it up. As someone who provides stories for folks to play with, I also like to make sure that there's plenty in there for, you to use as GM to kind of tell interesting other stories. So, for example, there's a soup kitchen called Soupstone, and this is outside the walls, and the owner of it is a halfling called Laren Lopi, and Soupstone has a rotating staff of cooks and servers, volunteers from the town, basically making food for farmers and for day laborers, and they, provide a warm meal and a warm hearth for these folk, especially in the winter months where it gets very, very, very cold. And one adventure hook that's in here is Laren has a bit of a problem. It's something that's concerning her, or him. And that is, every evening when he's cleaning up all the bowls and taking them into the kitchen, he has found at the bottom of one soup bowl every day, he's found a platinum piece in the bottom of the soup bowl. He's not sure where it's coming from. He's not sure who's leaving it here, but there's something a little strange about the platinum piece. And mind you, a platinum piece is a lot of money in a place like Soupstone in the field outside of Wyrmbone. But the coin is of elven mint and is at least 500 years old. All of them have been. And that's really weird. And it's starting to trouble him that someone has excuse me, a stash of coins this old, and he'd love to get to the bottom of it. Mostly to thank them. But also, who has a stash of ancient elven money and is giving it away? He doesn't know what to do with it. Other adventures involve things like, let me see here. Where was it? So, the Wandering Shrine continues to move from place to place to place. This is a relatively small shrine. It's made of a simple altar and a bunch of hand-carved symbols and icons dedicated to Sylara. And oddly, no one ever is there to give sermons, and no one is attending the altar. And stranger still, no one sees anyone disassemble it and move it somewhere else. It just seems to move around town kind of randomly. The locals don't seem to pay any bother to this. They've come to learn that after only a day or two, it moves. And some of the people who most frequently come to it and offer up donations are gloamlings. And there are some that think the gloamlings might be the ones actually moving it around. But the gloamlings seem very concerned and agitated whenever it moves, and are interested in getting to the bottom of that. So that might be an adventure that your PCs go on. Why does the shrine move? How does it move? What's going on there? Especially if you had, say, a cleric of Sylara in the group, she might definitely want to get to the bottom of that particular mystery. So it's the sort of place where I want to make sure there are plenty of kind of sinister plots and monsters and things to fight and things to uncover. But I also want to make sure there's plenty of role-playing encounters and plenty of opportunities for your players to kind of explore their characters and explore the world. So, yeah. So that's the Icescar Valley. That is the town of Wyrmbone in the setting of Eventide.